This is why you should never let your supplier in China organise the freight. One of the most common conversations I have each week is with people who call our office and say something along the lines of, I'm buying something from overseas, my supplier is organising the freight and they told me I need to find someone in Australia to help me with the customs clearance and delivery. Can you please provide me with a quote? Alternatively, they'll say something along the lines of, my supplier's quote for the freight was much cheaper than yours, or that the freight was included in the price of the goods. So they are under the illusion that they are getting a great deal, when in reality there's a myriad of hidden costs that they'll be billed for when the cargo arrives in Australia that are often normally not disclosed, quoted or discussed in any way prior to the shipment departing China. As the age-old saying goes, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Here's a real-life example to be able to explain what I mean. We had a client use our online instant quote system to get himself a quote to move 2.8 cubic metres from China to Australia. Our quotes online are based on FOB or free on board buying terms, which means our quotes include the freight from China to Australia, as well as all the local Australian port charges, customs and quarantine and clearance, as well as the delivery. Essentially every cost you need to factor in when choosing to import items into Australia. Our quote came to $1,100 as pictured here. Feel free to pause the video if you want to have a look at the breakdown. This client's supplier told him that he could get the goods to Australia for only US $250 or around 400 Australian dollars. So without speaking to us, he decided to book with the supplier thinking he was getting a good deal. Sadly, this was not the case.
I'm allergic to scams.
After the shipment was on its way, the supplier sent in the documentation and told him that he will need to find a customs broker here in Australia to assist with the clearance and delivery. So he got back in touch with us, told us he booked the freight with the supplier and asked us to help him with the clearance and delivery. He was also freaking out about a large invoice he had been sent from a company here in Australia that he had never heard of. Here is a copy of that exact invoice, with fees totaling around $1,400. These charges have come from the company tasked with handling the full container once it arrives here in Australia. They need to move it off the port and organise to get the goods unpacked and separated. And they bill everyone with cargo inside the container a portion of these costs. And these companies are renowned for completely ripping off novice and first-time importers who don't know any better. I mean, check out all these charges. So many of these are simply made up. It's absolute nonsense, and they are straight up ripping him off. What will happen is the supplier will get a rebate or a kickback for booking the cargo through one of these companies. So they're incentivized to handle the freight for you. But in order to afford these kickbacks in China, they need to massively overcharge the importer here in Australia so they can send money back to China to give to the supplier. So you pay the supplier for the freight, and the supplier's already got a margin on this, and then the consolidation company they book through also gives them a rebate because their agent who looks after the shipment here in Australia is instructed to bill exorbitant amounts of money to the importer before the shipment is released, and to hold the shipment if they don't pay. It's a complete rip-off, it's extortion, and by the time you realise what's happening, it's often too late to do anything about it, as they already control your shipment and your cargo is essentially held as ransom. So to recap, this client paid the supplier $400 for the freight from China to Australia. He now has to pay $1,400 for the port charges, and he still needs to find a company who will complete the clearance and delivery for him, which will easily cost an additional $300 to $500. So in summary, if he was to buy on FOB terms and organise the freight, clearance and delivery through us, it would have cost him $1,100, but because he accepted the supplier's US $250 freight price, the shipment ended up costing him well over $2,000, more than double what it should have had he previously understood the hidden costs. Now, I personally hate this stuff with a passion, so in this case I jumped in and helped the importer, called the rip-off merchants here in Australia, and was able to secure the client a partial credit, although it's still been a lot more expensive than it would have had he just have gone through us in the first place. Although through all this, he's learned a very valuable lesson: never let the supplier organise the freight. The other major reason not to let the supplier organise the freight has to do with control and mitigating risk. If the supplier controls the freight, they control the shipment and have the ability to hold the shipment at any point, and in doing so, it can potentially cost you thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars in storage charges if things go wrong. To give you a quick example, if you've paid a deposit for the goods to get them manufactured and shipped, and then after they depart China, you send through the final payment to the supplier. If all of a sudden the supplier says the funds never arrived into their bank account, you are in a really bad situation. And unless you do whatever it takes to get the supplier to release the shipment to you, then they have the ability to hold the shipment and force it into storage here in Australia while they request more money. And since you're the consignee on the bill of lading, you are legally responsible for the storage costs here in Australia, which can mount very, very quickly. You're essentially in between a rock and a hard place through no fault of your own, and sadly I've seen cases like this before that have turned into an absolute nightmare for the importer and has literally cost tens of thousands of dollars while they argue back and forth with the supplier. Now, if you would organise the freight through a local Australian freight forwarder, you retain control of the shipment, and even if there is a dispute with the supplier, then we have the ability to avoid all these extra costs while it's worked out, as the forwarder here in Australia works for you and should have your best interests at heart. And because they organised and controlled the shipment, they will have the ability to get the cargo out of the storage facility to ensure these costs don't snowball while things are worked out with the supplier. All in all, there's absolutely no advantages to allow the supplier to control the freight. It's more risky for you, it's often much more expensive once all the hidden and unquoted costs are taken into account, and you have no control when things don't go as planned. Here at Willship, we are always upfront about costs from the get-go, so there are no surprises. We hate hidden fees and are very against these underhanded industry practices that continue to rip off Australians. So remember, always buy on FOB or ex-works buying terms from China, and always book the freight through a local Australian freight forwarder who works for you and wants the best result for you and your shipment.